Well, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from whatever you're joining us. I'm very happy to have you here for our user call today. The topic is driving governance without sacrificing velocity with scorecards. And we have Alex and Michael today with us. I will let them introduce themselves. My name is Dalia, and I work here as a community manager. I drive our community programs, community webinars. So I will ask all of you to please put your questions in the Q&A function on the bottom so we can then track them and answer one after another. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat function that you can see as well. This webinar is being recorded, so you will receive a message from us, or sorry, an email with all the recording and some resources. You can also find the recording on YouTube. I will show the link, I will send the link in the chat here. And with that, Alex, please take it away from here.
Sure. Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, as mentioned, my name's Alex. I run the product marketing team here at Kong, but I focus specifically on service catalog and scorecards, which we'll be talking about in the session today. And I am joined by Michael Field. He is one of our technical product marketers in the team. He also focuses specifically on service catalog and Konnect as a part of the larger Kong product and platform portfolio. So Michael, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
With that, let's get rolling. So we're going to be talking about this sort of balancing governance velocity, mostly as it pertains to discovery of assets and the measurement of your APIs and services as assets, measuring their compliance with your organizational best practices. And we'll talk about how that fits into the governance and velocity story throughout the presentation. I have a few slides that I'm going to go through. But we're hoping to get everyone out of here in about 30 to 40 minutes. We know that everyone is busy, and we really appreciate you all taking the time to hang out with us for this session. So we want to make sure we respect that time and get you all out of here as quickly as we possibly can. So the slides we're going to cover, I'm going to talk about the two sides of API discovery. We're going to dig into the Konnect service catalog and the offering that it provides around velocity, governance, discovery. We're going to talk a little bit about scorecards specifically and how they play, and then I'm going to hand it to Michael to run us through a demo of Konnect Service Catalog and the Service Catalog scorecards. So with that, let's level set, right? So when we speak to a lot of our customers, a lot of the platform teams that are implementing Kong and Kong Konnect specifically, sort of as the API platform foundation of their larger platform engineering and larger internal developer platform efforts, right? There are a lot of steps that are required, lots of jobs to be done within the API platform side of the house. But there are two that I want to focus on today. You'll notice here on the Discover section. In our space, a lot of the times, I think solutions, vendors, et cetera, and organizations and API teams have really thought about discovery as being sort of one-sided, right? Where I think organizations have typically focused on the consumer side of discovery. And looks, I realized I just skipped ahead. And what does that consumer side of discovery look like? It looks like API consumers being able to find various APIs and services in a self-service manner so they can build applications that rely on those APIs. So these API consumers are typically the application developers as API consumers. What do they need? They need to find something like a developer portal, API catalog, find the API, try it, see documentation for it, and ultimately self-serve register, subscribe their application to it so their application can start consuming that API. But as you can see here, there's another side of discovery, right? And this is what I call the producer or the platform. Some people refer to it as the internal. I don't love that verbiage as much because there are internal API consumers as app devs as well. But you can think about it sort of as the producer or platform team facing side of discovery, where your producers and your platform engineers, they also need to be able to discover the various API assets that exist in the org. Discover, not just see that they're there and find them, but see relevant information about those services. So things like service ownership, things like how are they secured? Are they under runtime infrastructure management? Is there observability set up? All the various things that they need to be able to see to make sure that those services are deployed properly, secured properly, made reliable. At the end of the day, are those services, those APIs compliant with organizational best practices? And both sides of discovery here are really relevant for velocity and governance, right? Because on the API consumer side, of course, well, if you're an app dev as API consumer, instead of having to build an API from scratch yourself, If there's one that already exists that provides a similar set of functionality or the same set of functionality as you need as dev, we can go find it and reuse it, right? That's a lot of time saved. That's going much, much faster. But also, if you are the API producer, maybe you're the developer, the actual API developer who's building and exposing an API via something like an API gateway, well, you want to make sure, or at least definitely your security teams want to make sure that what you're building is built in compliance with organizational best practices. But you also want to be able to go fast, right? You want to be able to ship something quickly without individuals looking over your shoulder or stopping you, constantly trying to implement manual review, right? And this is where you'll see something like Service Catalog and Scorecards comes into play. But we're going to get there in just a few slides and describe how that works. So this is how Kong has prioritized these two sides, right? We have focused, yes, first we focused on this API consumer side of discovery with the developer portal, self-service catalog for all the API assets that the developers who are building APIs build. They can publish them, catalog them as self-service API products. But what we're going to be focused today is on the Konnect service catalog. And this is that producer or platform team facing side of API discovery. So what is Konnect service catalog? It starts here, right? It starts by eliminating the shadow or ghost API problem, right? By actually discovering the various APIs and services that you have running across your organization. Now, that discovery works by ingesting those APIs and services across or from multiple sources. Yes, from your existing Kong runtime infrastructure. So Service Catalog can see what you have running in your API gateways, what you have running on and Mesh. We can discover that, ingest it, boom, those APIs and services are cataloged. But it's not just Kong runtime infrastructure that Konnect Service Catalog integrates into. There's also third-party providers, something like Traceable, the API security solution, that we can integrate with as well. And then we can essentially see all the APIs and services that something like Traceable can see. Once we have that integration set up, or you have that integration set up, boom, you can see all the APIs and services in Konnect Service Catalog, single system of record, single source of truth, right, for the APIs and services that exist. Now, this on its own is incredibly valuable, right? If you are the platform team, this is a velocity driver, right? Instead of having to go manually ask or seek out in Slack channels or Confluence pages or wherever it might be, you have a single place to automatically discover the APIs and services that exist and are running in your organization. But we've layered on even more value here in the service catalog with these other integrations, right? Integrations with things like Slack, with things like GitLab, PagerDuty, DataDog, various Atlassian solutions, right? And Service Catalog can, by integrating with these solutions, attribute the necessary context that you either as developer or a platform team or a security team or a governance team, et cetera, needs to see about these APIs and services that have been discovered. Right. So, for example, I could see any Slack channels that might be associated with a specific API or service. I could see an observability dashboard that's been set up that's associated with a specific service. We integrate with something like Swagger Hub, so you can actually get the spec and see documentation for the various APIs and services that have been discovered. There are other integrations as well, but I don't have time to get into all of them. Right. But the thing that I want to really focus on here, if we think about the theme of today's session, velocity governance, clearly this is a major governance boon, right? Because now you have your various security platform teams, whatever teams in the org are responsible for ensuring visibility and governance across the API lifecycle. They have a single place they can go to see the information they need to make sure that APIs and services have the things set up that need to be set up to make sure they're compliant with your organizational best practices. And now you, as the developer who's actually building this API and service, you actually don't have to worry about making sure that all these integrations are set up. You don't have to worry about going and tracking down all these individual sources of truth, because Service Catalog essentially sets that up for you, right? The platform team can implement Service Catalog, make sure the integrations are set up, and all that information is automatically ingested, right? So once again, governance boon for the teams concerned with governance. You can just focus on building APIs and applications that consume those APIs, and all of the various governance relevant information can be ingested and displayed to your platform teams, security teams, et cetera, all automatically in the background. So you don't have to worry about it as the developer. But it doesn't just stop there. I mentioned earlier, compliance with organizational best practices, ensuring that the APIs that are being built in line with specific security standard, documentation standard, production readiness standards, reliability, resilience, uptime, business continuity related standards. These are all things that oftentimes slow down the SDLC and become a major pain for developers who might be building APIs or building the applications that consume those APIs. Because let's face it, it can be very, very difficult to keep track of all those standards as you're building. And what ends up happening is, okay, we build something, we ship it, we think it's good, we think it's ready. And then right before it can get shipped, it gets stopped by some checkpoint, some guardrail, right? And then oftentimes the security team or someone like that might be brought in. And then it becomes this manual debugging and resolution process, right? Or even worse, something actually gets shipped to prod, it's out there, not compliant, something bad happens, right? And now instead of spending the next few sprints or the next sprint or the next few days building the next new thing we want to ship, right? The next new bit of core business that we want to ship to market, we're fixing breaches, we're fixing reliability, resilience issues, incidents, et cetera, et cetera. And this is where scorecards come in. Scorecards automate the measurement of a service or an API's compliance with your organizational best practices, right? So for all the APIs and services that Service Catalog discovers and then has under inventory in Konnect, you can implement these scorecards per service. So we have multiple kinds of already pre-canned, pre-built scorecards, but one good example would be something like a security scorecard, right? So you can implement a security scorecard that says, well, best security practices are to ensure that the OWASP API security top 10 threats are mitigated for, right? Use a scorecard to measure, well, do we have proper authorization? How many times has there been a potential security incident in the last X or Y amount of months, et cetera, et cetera. The measurement of that, the reporting of that services, compliance with those best practices and standards is automated so that your platform and security teams can automatically, one, they can see what services might not be compliant, easily report against them. But then also as the developer who might be building and exposing the API, you can see where one of your services and APIs might be failing, and then you can see what you need to do to resolve that, right? All without the manual back and forth with the respective teams that want to make sure that the APIs and services are compliant. So Mike is going to demo this in just a few minutes here. And once again, just sort of setting the stage for how, yes, the measurement and visibility into compliance here, major governance boom, but also, yes, it does accelerate time to market because you can focus on building, and when there is an issue, you can quickly resolve it, right? Because you can see these specific things, these specific best practices that have not been adhered to during the development process. And how does this work within the larger sort of governance and velocity story instead of API platform best practices with something like Kong and Kong Konnect? So if you think about the sort of history of API programs, specifically the parts of the programs that are related to the provisioning and deployment of API infrastructure, so I think typically something like an API gateway, back in the day, you could have something that was called sort of ultimate freedom, right? So we're totally velocity focused. We're not going to worry about which gateways are being used, where they're being deployed, where they're being hosted, what authorization logic is being used, what traffic shaping, transformation, et cetera, kind of logic is being implemented at the proxy layer, or maybe some devs are building it into the actual backend API layer themselves, right? What did this do? Well, allow devs to go as fast as they wanted, right? But very difficult to proactively enforce best practices. Near impossible to ensure consistency across the entire API estate. And ultimately, once that would start to scale out, now you might have hundreds or thousands of APIs, each with different authorization implementations, for example. Well, what happens when your organization tries to standardize? Well, maybe it was fast at first, right? But now it's going to be a very slow and manual process to make sure that everything that had been built has the standardized authorization best practices, for example, that the organization is moving to. And I think that the market sort of overreacted to this, right? The sort of totally ultimate freedom, totally velocity oriented, real inconsistent approach to API development. And that overreaction then ended up looking like a model that looked like ultimate central control, right? And this was, and to be very clear, whichever, like the three models on the screen, depending on the organization and the use case, sometimes each of these works, right? So we're not saying anything bad necessarily. There's nothing inherently wrong with any of these models. It has to do with use case and scale and what's best for the business at that specific moment in the business's maturity and journey. So for some organizations, this ultimate control, what I refer to as the central API team model, might work. But once again, at scale, we see it breaking down. And why? Well, to avoid the lack of best practices and consistency, the central API team essentially became the ultimate delegator and ultimate controller over API infrastructure. So if developer had gone and developed this backend API, they needed infrastructure spun up so they could expose it, needed authorization logic at that infrastructure layer, so at the gateway layer, needed some traffic shaping, some transformation logic, whatever you needed from the gateway, that requirement would then get submitted to the central API team, and it's up to them to then spin up, provision that infrastructure, and set everything up for the dev. That might work at a small scale, but now if you're talking about hundreds and thousands of APIs, well, that central API team can become a major bottleneck, right? This is where we see the market sort of moving, this best of both worlds approach, where you can allow for the self-serve provisioning and spinning up of API infrastructure, but within the confines and guardrails of a larger platform. And this is really what we enable in Konnect. And yes, this might sound like too much of the infrastructure side of the house. We're talking about service catalog and scorecards, but the reality is service catalog and scorecards play a major role here, right? Because once you have an infrastructure spun up, once you have the APIs exposed as gateway services in something like Konnect, well, this is where you can start using service catalog to make sure those are properly cataloged. Make sure you can use something like scorecards to make sure that those services are measured, right? Their compliance with your organizational best practices are measured, right? So it's not just the freedom and the velocity on the infrastructure side, but yes, also now the freedom and the velocity at the actual API and service development side as well. So once again, I just wanted to contextualize that within the context of a larger API platform. But with that, like I said, we want to make sure we can try to get you all out of here in 40-ish minutes today. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Mike, and Mike is going to give a demo of Konnect Service Catalog and Scorecard specifically. So take it away, Mike.
Sweet. Great presentation, Alex. I will go ahead and pull up my screen now. All right. Are you able to see Konnect, Alex?
Yep. You're all good.
Perfect. So cool. We're going to dive into Service Catalog, get into the weeds a little bit here. And I want to start out by actually introducing the object model of Service Catalog and how this works. You know, Alex alluded to a few things, but now that we're taking a look at the real thing here, we can dive in a bit. So one of the core concepts here is the concept of integrations. And this is basically where you're going to be pulling in these different resources that make up your services. So of course, everything that we have inside Konnect, whether it's analytics, API products, of course, your actual gateway services or your mesh services, can be pulled directly into Service Catalog. And I'll show what that looks like here in just a minute. But part of the power here is also being able to work with third-party services to give you that full 360 visibility into the service. So, you know, if you guys are a DataDog shop and that's where you store all your analytics data, you can also bring that into a service. You can link in something like PagerDuty to show the engineer on call if there's an issue with one of these services. And of course, supporting different Git repos like GitHub and GitLab. So you can see all the repo details. You know, you can see what programming language was used inside of the connected repo. You can see pull requests, contributors, and you can also kind of track the lag. So you can have different metrics like, okay, we want every pull request, any pull request that hasn't been responded to in over 72 hours is considered stale. So again, these are all the different integrations we support today. But you also have the ability to request integrations that we don't have. So we have a number of popular options here, or you can request something that you don't see. So this is something that's going to continue to grow throughout the year. Now, the next part of the object model I want to look at is the actual resources. So once you actually set up these integrations and link them to your accounts, you can see the ones I have linked here. This is going to pull in a number of different resources types. Now, the actual resource you see is going to depend on the underlying integration. So you're going to see here, I have a lot of different gateway services. Makes sense. Obviously, it's going to be tied directly to the gateway manager. But I can see here, I can see the different resources types. So I can look at things like GitHub and see repos that I've connected, or Swagger Hub if I want to pull in specifications. And again, each of these resources, it's a very broad term because it's essentially just a JSON object. So if I open one of these up, I can see the repo, and it's going to have an underlying JSON structure. Now, if I switch to looking at a gateway service, again, I can get the high level information, like what control plane this is tied to, where does the service expose? And again, at the end of the day, it's just a different type of JSON object. Now, when you pull in all these resources against all these different integrations, again, you could be having a very, very wide scope as to what's going on inside your organization. So the next thing we want to look at is the concept of the actual services here. And a service in Service Catalog is nothing more than a grouping of different resources. So you can group them into, based on, product lines that you have, maybe inside of different business units. And so if we open up one of these services, I can see everything that's linked here. So I have my underlying gateway services, which are essentially my APIs that are part of this overall billing service. I can see any API products that I might have exposed inside of the developer portal. I can see the underlying repo where this code was built, and I can see, the latest commit, what language is being used, any open issues or PRs. I can also see a dashboard for tying different analytics. So I can actually tie different reports to this service and come review this in detail inside of the analytics viewer. So if there's reports you often reference for one of your services, you can link that here as well. Scorecards we're going to skip. We're going to come back to that. Again, I can come here and see the underlying resources. So these are the gateway manager resources. I can see also I have an analytics report in the GitHub repo we were just looking at. I can add additional documentation about what's going on inside the service. Of course, specifications for my different underlying APIs. And then any changes to resources that are linked are tracked here as events. Now, before I dive into the scorecards and adding that governance aspect to one of these services, I actually want to switch over to our gateway manager real quick and kind of define the problem that we're trying to solve. So if we go to our gateway manager, we can see just inside of my environment here, I have a ton of different control planes. The ones we're going to focus on here today are along the bottom. So I basically have the same three services. I have the billing team. They have their own control plane to set up all their plugins in their gateway services. The same thing on the shipping team. And what I've actually done is combine the billing and the shipping team because we can see here based on these tags that they're both hybrid deployments. I brought them under a single control plane group to use shared hybrid infrastructure. So if I pull that up, I can see a list of all the underlying services. I can see the routes that they're exposed on. I can see different plugins that are applied. So I can see key authentication has been applied to some of these services. So I can see if I go look here, okay, the payment gateway does have some form of authentication on it. But you can see quickly as this starts to scale, I'm only looking at, I think, 6 individual APIs here. This starts to scale across a larger organization where you might have tens or hundreds, even thousands of services. You can't come here and just manually review, which of these have authentication plugins tied to them and check things like rate limiting. And additionally, these are just the ones deployed to this hybrid gateway. If I go back, we can see over here, the commerce team is actually deployed on a cloud gateway. So if I open this up, I can see that they're actually using an AWS gateway deployed in US West. And again, they have their own collection of services. They have their own collections of routes and using key authentication on some of these services. So if I on the platform team want to drive governance over all these disparate services and control planes, it becomes quite difficult to do at scale. You need some kind of means of, essentially having reports and status updates based on the governance rules that you want to enforce. And this is where scorecards comes into play. So I'm going to jump back to Service Catalog now. Going to open up some of the scorecards here. And we can see here, the two that I'm using right now is I have a scorecard based on what we're calling Konnect's best practices, and we'll dive into some of the criteria there, and also service documentation. I can see it's been applied to all 3 of my services. Again, these are the 3 services I have, which you can be selective about that, but I've gone ahead and applied these scorecards to all available services. So let's go ahead and open this up and take a closer look. So now I can actually see the individual score that each of these services is receiving. So if I go ahead and open up the billing resource, we can see that I actually own this service, and I can see actually where I'm failing based on the criteria of the scorecard. So I do have documentation files kind of explaining what the service is about. I do have API specifications, but I can see here that some of the specs are not passing some of the rules I have. So I'm just using the Open API recommended linting rules. And we can see here that while 2 of my services are passing, the tax calculator service is actually failing here. I can go here and view more details on it and see exactly what is actually failing based on the OAS recommended linting rules. And I can see it's missing the required property of info and of paths. I can also go here and look at these other ones. And again, neither of these are failing, so they're meeting all the linting rules we have. If we go here and take a look at Alex's shipping service, we can see all of his specs are actually passing the linting rules. But even though we told him a number of different times, he still has not added documentation to the service. So we're actually failing here. So go ahead.
I'm stubborn.
Stubborn every time. We tell him to add it, and he says he does, but we can see
Difficult to make me without the scorecard like this, showing me that it's failing,
we gotta keep extra eyes on a guy like Alex. He says he's gonna do something, doesn't always follow through here. So we can see that this is actually still failing. So this is something that needs to be corrected on the scorecard. And just to show real quick before we actually take a look about how to correct those, we can also take the criteria view. So we can see that only one of the 3 services actually had this documentation. We can see that they all have a specification, but we can see that one of these is actually failing, which is the one, again, my billing service actually does not follow the rules we have set for linting the Open API spec. So let's go ahead and actually correct these real quick. So first off, I'll go ahead and correct my own service here, which is the billing service. So I'm going to switch over to my IDE here. And this is basically the underlying Open API spec. As we can see here, not a lot going on, has no pass, has no info. Now, conveniently, I have one already set here. So I'm going to update the spec. We're going to go ahead and save that. And then we're going to go ahead and commit this. So we're going to go ahead and fix that spec. And we're going to go push that to the underlying repo. So I've made some changes to the specification, and I've added in both the info field and the pass field, because again, these are the 2 things that are being called out by the scorecard. Now, since Alex is so stubborn, we're actually going to do him a favor, and we're going to go over to his shipping service and add some documentation for him. So let's switch over to our services. Nope, we're back. Go inside here. Let's go inside documents, and let's go ahead and add just an empty document here. We'll just go ahead and call it a README. And we'll go in here and we'll just give it a title. Alex's first doc quite late. And we'll go ahead and save that guy. So now he has some documentation in there. Not very good documentation, but we'll have to talk to him about that, going beyond just adding a title there, but meeting the basic criteria of having some documentation on the service. So we can see now that the overall score has changed for these. And if we go back and look at the billing service here, we can see now that my billing service, each of the underlying gateway services in their spec are now passing our linting rules. And if we look at the shipping service, Alex has now also reached 100% because he does have 1 or more documentation files on his service. So just digging this a little bit further, let's actually open up the scorecard so you guys can see some of the underlying configuration. So today we are basically offering different templates. Actually, let me start from scratch so you can see the other templates. Let's go ahead and create a new scorecard. So the first thing you do is select a scorecard template. So we can see we have Kong's best practices. We can do security and compliance, service documentation, and service maturity. Now, service catalog is still in beta, but down the road, you'll actually be able to create your own totally custom scorecards. But these templates, you can add some of your own customization as well. So if we do a Kong best practices template, we can see some of these pre-populated fields, and you can then turn some of these off individually. But what this allows us to do is this is kind of focused around error rates and latency. So I can define what is an acceptable amount of error to have over the last 30 days, or I can modify to a different time range. I can look at the 95 percentile of the response latency or something different. I can look at the mean or the median and ensuring that's a less than a certain amount of milliseconds, again, over whatever time period I want. And I can also require plugins installed from different categories. So, if I want to require that everybody has some form of authentication without actually enforcing the type of authentication, that's an option here as well. Just because I do want to focus on this, because folks that are familiar with the control plane groups I was looking at before, you are able to push certain policies over all member control planes. So again, maybe if we're logging to DataDog, I could set that up at the global level. And so every service that is added to that control plane group automatically has login to DataDog. But this governance aspect still allows the teams to maintain their flexibility on how they want to implement these different things, as long as they are implementing something. So again, if we want to have some form of security, or some form of rate limiting here, that forces each service to implement something without, again, making everything too top down and forcing exactly how that becomes implemented over their services. Now, again, the scorecard we were just looking at was applied to all services, but you can get much more granular if I want to apply it to specific services or do smart selections based on owners. So for Alex, I'd probably set up a couple scorecards just for him to make sure he stays in compliance. And the last thing we'll go here and take a look at is just the other Kong best practices scorecard. We can see here it's down to 22%. just to give an idea of what the criteria is inside of the scorecard. And again, what we were just showing, it's more about the response latency and some of the error rates and also missing authentication plugins. So if we look at the response latency and we look at my billing service, we can see 2 of these meet these criteria, but our tax calculator is well over the 50 milliseconds. So it's actually up that 258 milliseconds of latency. So that's something we might want to dig into a little bit further. Same thing if we go here and look at the authentication requirement, we can see only the Commerce plugin actually has an authentication plugin installed for each of the underlying gateway services. But both my billing services and Alex's shipping service here are lacking authentication plugins on each of the services. So just a brief overview and demo there, but hopefully that makes it quite clear the power of having this central governance, especially as you start to scale out the number of services and the number of control planes that you're using inside of your organization. So I'll go ahead and pause there and see what questions we might have.
We do have 2 questions, Mike. One, and I think you covered a little bit here, but perhaps we could discuss it more broadly. I assume the scorecards work with OAS linting. Is there a way to have something like quality gate in your pipeline to prevent APIs that do not fulfill certain scores from being published in the gateways?
So to my knowledge, that's something with a potentially a more long-term goal. I don't think it will be part here as the initial release, but that is something that will be achievable once it's GA and the API is available. So as part of your automation pipeline, you can check the scores of your different services and whatever you want that cutoff threshold to be, if that is not hit, obviously, you can branch to a different way in your automation pipeline and prevent publishing that to your gateway.
Awesome. And then when can we see an API to manage scorecards? I think that's referring to something somewhat similar. There actually being like an admin API for scorecards. My understanding is we do not have that live right now, but that is coming imminently. So keep an eye out on our docs and our blogs and on our just general our wider release and launch material.
Yep, that'll be part of the GA release for sure.
Cool. If we didn't, hopefully those 2 questions were answered sufficiently. For those that did ask, if you still have questions around these topics, feel free to put them in the Q&A. But I don't think there's anything else right now. Dalia, do you see anything else?
Well, first, thank you, both of you, for the great presentation and the demo. And yeah, I'm trying to see, but no, not for now. So everyone, any last questions for Alex and Michael before we hang up? Now is the time to ask. And if not, you can always ask on our community Slack. So I will type it in the chat so you can join.
And I'd also say I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. So if you have any questions, you feel free to connect and ask me direct there if you all would prefer.
And you will receive email later on today or tomorrow with the recording and some resources. Yeah, join us on Slack if you have any questions. Find us on LinkedIn. But yeah, I think that's it. Thank you so much, Alex, Michael. It was a pleasure having you here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And I wish you all a great day, great evening, and I will see you soon.
Great.
Awesome. Thanks,
Well,
everyone.
Bye, everyone.
bye.